Governor Locke, you've had one of the great political careers in recent American history, but I'd like to take you back to where your family comes from. And the story of your family starts in Taishan, in the Pearl River area of China. What did your family tell you about where you came from?
Well, the folks really didn't talk that much about the family village, other than this was the source of the Locke clan and most of the Chinese here in the state of Washington, that they all came from that area. In fact, that was the area that was the source of the laborers during the gold rush, the Transcontinental Railroad, the people who really made it possible for the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad when it was stuck outside the mountains of California, and then into the canneries and to the coal mines. That was really the source of, that area was the source of all the immigration from China up until maybe the 1960s, when then people started coming from Hong Kong and Taiwan and so forth. But we did talk about the poverty of the village. And that's why I always remember Mom and Dad sending back money to the village during, at special times of the year. And it wasn't until later on that I understood why. Because it was the sacrifice of people in the village. And this was very common in those days, where people would pool their money together to send someone to America. So the success of the Locke clan was really due to the sacrifices and the contributions of everyone in the village.
There's also a story about your grandfather, one of your grandfathers, and in Olympia, Washington, and the job he had and why he took that job.
My grandfather came over to the United States when he was a teenager, 11 or 12 years old. And we're not really sure how he came here, but he ended up serving as a houseboy, a servant boy for a family in the state capitol, washing dishes, cleaning the floors, doing laundry, and helping with the cooking. And here I was inaugurated as governor of the state of Washington, moving into the governor's mansion exactly 1 mile from the house. And I joked in the inaugural speech that it took our family 100 years to move that 1 mile.
And in that 1 mile, there, of course, is a tremendous story of the success of Asian Americans, of Chinese Americans. Starting out as they came, you talk about Gold Mountain, and the first wave of Chinese immigration to the United States takes place during the gold rush in 1849, California, and eventually Seattle, remarkably changed by the gold rush in the Yukon in the 1890s. And Chinese immigrants came as laborers, essentially, in the canning industry, in the digging for gold, or in the lumber industry, which is obviously huge. And you grew up in public housing. Is that correct?
My father was a World War II veteran, part of the Normandy invasion. And after the war, he went back to Hong Kong, met my mom, and they got married, and he brought her back to Seattle. But we, for the first few years, lived in Yesler Terrace Housing Project, which was public housing, primarily for returning veterans and low-income individuals, and even some university medical students. So, and it's not very far from here, and it's not very far from Chinatown. And then later on, my dad bought a house also not far from here. So our whole family has really been around this area of what is now the Chinatown International District.
And so this area, Yesler Way, was one of the dividing lines in Seattle in the early days. But it was a place where low income, the day laborers, the migrant and seasonal laborers came. It was actually, at one point, Seattle was known as the city of hotels, because all these laborers, being seasonal and migrating to Alaska or to the fields or to the forest for the lumber or the mines, were only seasonally in Seattle. Did you have a sense of that growing up after the Second World War, that this was that kind of territory, or things changed?
Well, things had changed a bit. Obviously not the seasonal workers, but you had a lot of elderly gentlemen living here, bachelors, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the policies that really prevented other people from China, namely women and laborers, from coming into the United States. And so you ended up with so many of the Chinese that came here at an early time not being able to bring families over. And so there were a lot of bachelors here. And my family oftentimes brought them home to our place for dinner and things like that. So Chinatown was very much a place of commerce to support the families that were able to come here and to settle here, but also really a source of housing for the Chinese bachelors.
So how did you become interested? When did you decide to become a politician, a servant of the people?
Well, I never thought growing up that I'd ever be a politician, but I was always fascinated with government. I got to meet, while I was in scouting, some of the political leaders, and I was just in awe of them. The mayor of Seattle, who came down and visited our Boy Scout troop at one time, seeing Wing Luke at a community theater event and hearing a lot about Wing Luke, and then seeing him in person. I never got to shake his hand or anything, but I was just so in awe of him. And people always talked about him, and people talked about his potential and where he could have gone had it not been for the tragic plane crash that he died in. Later on, when I finally did decide to run for office, and that was only after many years working as a community activist and participating in Asian American organizations pushing for affirmative action, housing policies, preservation of the Chinatown International District, that people said, "Hey, Gary, why don't you run for office?" And I said, "What, me?" But I had by then volunteered for a lot of people's campaigns, really enjoyed, knocking on doors, passing out brochures, or helping put up yard signs. And so the more I thought about it, I said, yeah, why not? I mean, if I really care about the issues that affect our community, then maybe I should try to be at the table to help set those policies.
And one thing that I think unites you with Wing Luke and is important in two ways in the history of Seattle, and particularly is real estate and housing and civil rights built around people living where they want to live and not where they're told they must live. Is that fair?
That is. Not only were the 60s and the 70s about civil rights in terms of segregation and employment and access to government contracts and things like that, but it was also about housing. Because, quite frankly, I grew up in the south end of Seattle, and there was almost an unspoken rule that we never went to the north end of Seattle. That if you're a person of color, you could buy a house maybe in the south end of Seattle, but not in the north end. So access to housing and fair housing policies and getting rid of redlining, where the banks basically would not provide loans for people in certain neighborhoods, that was hard to overcome. And certainly, Wing Luke was a trailblazer, just being in terms of civil rights, and then the rest of us really trying to carry on that torch.
And the buildings that surround us, that surround the Wing Luke Museum and this building itself, which was a hotel, single room only for laborers who came from China, is a symbol of, I think, both the difficulty, the discrimination, and then the efforts of the Chinese and Japanese Americans to build Seattle.
I mean, it was the people of color that really established Seattle and indeed much of the West Coast. It was immigrants. And in fact, other than the Native Americans, America is really a land of foreigners. We're all foreigners, except for whether we're first generation or 10th generation, whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower, a slave vessel from Africa, or a steamer from Asia. Except for the Native Americans, we're all foreigners. And I really believe that the prosperity of America, the energy, the vitality of America is due to that diversity of culture, people, languages, and religions and viewpoints.
And Asian Americans have played a huge role in the tech industry that now is one of our dominant, if not in fact our dominant industry in America, a value-added industry.
Well, when you look at so many of the great companies here in the United States in tech, in biotech, medical research, many of them were founded by Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. And so we're really proud of our cultural heritage and the contributions to civilization of our ancestral lands. But we're really proud of what America stands for and the opportunities that America provides.
And having an educated population is so important in Seattle and Washington. The university system, things that you worked on as governor, are enormously important to maintaining a workforce that can support the big tech industries. So Seattle is sometimes called the gateway to the Pacific. And when you were Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration, in which there was a reorientation to the Pacific. Is the future of this country tied to the Pacific and to our relations with China, Japan?
Well, much of our future will be, and more of our future as a country will be with the Asia-Pacific region, because so much of the world's population is there. And so if we want jobs for the American people, and we make such great products, and there's such a high demand for made in America goods and services, we need to look more to the Pacific, where the population is. Because the more, and we had this motto at the Department of Commerce, the more we export, the more goods our companies produce. The more they produce, the more workers they need, and that means good paying jobs for the American people.
So I'd like to ask you about a situation that's reminiscent of a situation in World War II. In World War II, we were fighting Japan, and Pearl Harbor created a situation where there's not just discrimination against Japanese Americans, but there was the internment,
Right.
famously, of Japanese Americans. Now we've got a situation where we're in a proto-Cold War. I'm not sure, I'd be interested in what you call it, with China. And there seems to be a rise in Asian American and maybe specifically Chinese American discrimination or some hate crimes, and a lot of discussion about that. Do all Americans understand what Asian Americans have done for America?
Well, first of all, I don't think enough Americans understand the contributions of many different ethnic groups to the prosperity and the success, the vitality of America, and certainly not much understanding of the contributions of Asian Americans, whether Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Chinese Americans, and those from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and India, and so forth. And that's really unfortunate because of our physical differences and readily apparent physical differences. I sometimes think that Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, that we're perpetual foreigners, and it's easy to stigmatize and discriminate and separate us out. This is a time of great division in our country, and while we have differences with the policies of various governments, I think we should try to separate that it's policy differences with governments and not with the people of other countries.
Do institutions like the Wing Luke Museum, which presents a Pan-Asian, all the various groups, can the museum play a role in educating Americans about what Asian Americans have done for all of us?
Well, we need museums like the Wing Luke and museums all across the country to tell the story of America, the contributions of different ethnic groups, whether from Europe, from Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, all parts of the world. I think that Americans need to focus more on our history, our unique history as a country, and that certainly extends to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And that's why institutions like Wing Luke that talk about the early Chinese settlers there, that these institutions are so important.